I'm delighted today to welcome David Cloutier, who is Associate Professor of Moral Theology at the Catholic University of America. David's work is focused on connecting moral theology with research on human behavior in the social sciences. And in particular, he's interested in the economy and the environment. David is also editor of the Moral Traditions book series, published by GU Press, for which we're very thankful. So thank you for being here today, David, to discuss the morality of reopening the economy.
Thanks for organizing this, Al. Your team has been great.
Thank you. So I'd like to start with, I guess, a question about how we're framing this issue as a society. Some politicians, I think, and some in the media are essentially saying that we have to choose between health and wealth. So, it's being framed as, maybe reopening the economy quickly will result in increased number of deaths from coronavirus, but that's a price we have to pay, the lesser of two evils compared with a cratering economy. And so I was just wondering, in your view, is that the only way that we can frame this choice that we have?
I'm glad you start with the question of framing choices. It's so important because I don't think that many of the frames out there are the most helpful. I always point out that the first question people should ask in ethics is simply the question, what are you doing? That's the question of act description, the way we describe what we're doing, and our attempts to do so truthfully, fully, as opposed to spinning it, really helps us act well. And so I've thought about this, and I think the most helpful way of framing the choices that we face now is a matter of whether or to what extent we allow individuals to make their own judgments about risk versus the requirement that we limit the harm to others and perhaps to those individuals themselves from their own misjudgments about risk. So I often use traffic analogies when I'm trying to help people think about ethics, because many of the traffic rules and regulations that we make involve certain kinds of rough trade-offs, and our willingness to follow those regulations are because we recognize the value and justice of the trade-offs. So no turn on red, or those pesky red left turn arrows that don't allow you to turn even when it's obviously safe,
right,
are a matter of trying to help people limit harm. But if we go too far in the limiting harm direction, people end up disregarding regulations, acting in other kinds of reckless ways. And in a way, I would want to point out, we're already doing this. So we're already all making choices about whether to have our groceries delivered or go to the grocery store, for example. We haven't really locked down the society or closed the economy. We have a kind of porous lockdown, I've seen it described as. And so the question about what sorts of risks and how to manage those risks seems to be the most fruitful. And then I would invite us to think then about the questions, who is most vulnerable? That's an obvious risk question. And then what events actually lead to contagion, which is to say, what are the kind of big targets that you want to focus on?
Right. Thank you. I'm going to jump right into a question that we have from a participant, because I think it follows well on what you've just said. So John Warren has asked, one of the issues seems to be that some individuals may determine that their risk is low, but their actions or non-actions could affect others, particularly the immunocompromised or the elderly. So how do we think about that?
So as I framed it, we recognize that it's not simply a matter of individuals risking their own health. We allow them to do that. It's a matter of limiting the harm that they might pose to others in making those choices. Start thinking through who are the vulnerable people And then how is it possible to help them successfully avoid contagion from others?
Thank you. So I mentioned at the beginning that you're a professor at Catholic University, and so I was wondering if you could tell us, sort of in broad terms, how Catholic social thinking can guide our discussion of this topic.
Sure, and as we've already started discussing, focusing on the most vulnerable is one aspect of that. But I think there are three ideas that I would highlight. The first idea is a kind of overarching theme in CST, the idea that the economy is supposed to serve people rather than people serve the economy.
Mm.
Whenever we're thinking about the economy, we shouldn't first and foremost be thinking about economic numbers. We should be thinking about the way in which the economy serves people. But of course, a shutdown economy does not serve people well, right? There are all sorts of ways in which obviously many people are currently working, and for example, the loss of tax revenue creates certain sorts of problems. So I would say that a main way that economies serve people well is by producing good work. Catholic social teaching holds very strongly to the idea that we realize our dignity through good work. That is a way we become more human. And I think the difficulty with this crisis is twofold on that theme. One, I would point out that our work is being harmed. So the online education, for example, clearly is a loss as to us as faculty, but also to students. But much more importantly, there is a kind of radical inequality in our work situation that has been raised. Our current shutdown tends to distribute the costs and benefits of the shutdown very unequally. So the shutdown clearly benefits the old at the expense of the young, for example. It clearly benefits professional workers who can often continue with their jobs and continue their income, whereas the costs are borne by so-called essential workers, which are really necessary for those of us who can work at home, but who are actually much more exposed to risk. And we're often not addressing those kinds of inequities. So we need to do a better job of thinking about the ways in which our resources can support work that we have now deemed as essential, both in terms of better working conditions for those people, like all the meatpacking plants are an obvious example, better working conditions for those people, and better wages. So that we say, well, we want to be safe and we want to have meat, so we're going to show how valuable the meat workers are by paying them proportionately.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to get in. So we've been talking about kind of trade-offs that have to be made kind of at this moment. But there's another way of thinking about this, I think, which is trade-offs between the present and the future. And so some people have argued that, that by shutting down the economy, of course, we're getting these immediate benefits in terms of hopefully, hospitals not overwhelmed, et cetera. But, that there could be an increase in what Angus Deaton and Ann Case have called deaths of despair. So increases in mental illness, in alcoholism and addiction, in people not getting treatment for chronic disease because they're afraid to go to the hospital. So how do we kind of balance, those thoughts, trying to protect the most vulnerable at the moment, but realizing that our actions could cause harm, down the road?
Yeah, one of the difficulties with so-called cost-benefit analyses is that they often leave out two things. One, that the costs and benefits are not equally shared. That is, the costs fall on one group and the benefits accrue to another group. And then the other is the one that you just mentioned, Al, which is that the timeframes of the benefits and the costs are different. So there are certain immediate benefits from the policies that we're pursuing, perhaps perhaps correctly. I would certainly argue correctly in the short term. But there are a number of long-term costs that will only be able to be totaled in a kind of domino effect of the future. So for example, one of the main reasons why we should recognize that the current form of shutdown can only go on for 2 or 3 months is that a crucial big chunk of the economy involves people paying rent and mortgages. And while you might be able to manage a month or two to tide things over, or as is the case in many jurisdictions, rents and mortgages are being allowed to roll over. That can't keep going on. There are people behind the rents and mortgages. As much as it would be nice to mythically imagine some evil landlord who is simply accruing gold coins and suddenly has fewer gold coins, the reality is that the system not only employs people but has to keep running. And so the long-term costs of, say, collapse in the housing market again, or of the collapse of small landlords who manage properties, which would displace a lot of people, obviously. These are long-term effects. At the college level, I'll just mention one other example. Obviously, all colleges are currently paralyzed with fear, you might say, about the fall, but that is in part because there are longer-term effects of a dip in admissions, for example, that are difficult to manage and won't really come due until 4 or 5 years from now.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to follow up on a question from a minute ago, because I have a nice comment question from Andrew Flesher, basically saying that the elderly are both the most vulnerable right now, but also potentially the most vulnerable long term. He says many studies have shown that the elderly are psychologically the least suited in terms of mental health to be isolated from others. So how do we craft a more holistic approach that avoids the dichotomy that your view might be interpreted to promote, which condemns the elderly to a life of loneliness?
That is a very powerful question, and one that bursts the bonds of any kind of quantitative analysis, right? Whether economic or simply epidemiological. The elderly manage to survive, so they're not added to the death figures, but they survive in a kind of isolated existence. I think about my 77-year-old mother living out her elder years under these kinds of conditions and all of the opportunities that she might not be able to pursue. So I think we have to think constructively about that. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to that problem, but I recognize that can sound like a cop-out answer. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but it's a real answer. That is, truthfully, there is no one-size-fits-all because the elderly is a kind of abstraction. We have many different kinds of vulnerabilities within the elderly and many different kinds of isolation that goes on. I think nursing homes are, to me, the gravest scandal of our entire situation, given the outrageous disproportion in the number of deaths that are happening in long-term care facilities. Those folks are already the most isolated and suffer from the kinds of conditions that the questioner asks about. So what to do about long-term care facilities, I think, is absolutely urgent.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is striking that I think something like one third of the deaths in the U.S. have been in those kind of homes.
So I looked at the figures this morning. In Maryland, 59% of all deaths in Maryland are nursing home deaths.
Yeah, I'm sure.
In Minnesota, it's almost 80%, kind of low contagion place. It's almost 80%.
Striking.
The figures are staggering.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering if you could say something about the elderly, I guess, in a more general way. It's been striking to me, some of the rhetoric, through this crisis on the part of some politicians has been just kind of remarkably callous about the elderly, And again, could you tell us a little bit about, how Catholic social thought and a kind of pro-life position would encompass thinking about the elderly?
Sure. Well, one of the traditional ways of thinking about the elderly, not only in Christian thought, but in many traditions, is to see them as a source of honored wisdom. That is to say, the old hold a kind of privileged and honored place in the society. This crisis probably strikingly shows us the way in which we're a society that doesn't think of the elderly in that way, and that our structures of caring for the elderly are broken and need to be fixed. Having said all of that, the elderly also face the most difficult trade-off in this situation. In 50 years ago, the elderly were the population that had the greatest percentage of people in poverty. Today, they have the least percentage of people in poverty, if you look through the age distributions. So there are certain ways in which the benefits of the shutdown accrue disproportionately to people who are not in the workforce and who are able to continue certain kinds of routines. So we have to address the issue of isolation of the elderly. But I don't think that the successful response is to force everyone to isolate with very uncertain benefits to the elderly. It's not clear that it's not clear how we would work out what is beneficial about the current situation to the elderly.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question here from Charlie Collier that I think is interesting, that he's asking about the language of reopening the economy, that suggests that there's kind of like one person with a key to do that. Whereas the reality, at least in our system, is that, we have authorities at all sorts of different levels, of course, and also individual businesses, and all sorts of things. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, the responsibilities of decision makers at different levels. What are the if you're the owner of a meat packing plant and you're trying to think about the food supply versus the safety of your workers, how do you think about that? What do you owe society? What do you owe the workers?
Well, and I certainly see this at colleges, but I just read this morning that McDonald's is preparing to have a reopening plan for its restaurants that is deeply concerned about the safety both of the workers and of customers, and to recognize that that's not just a cynical marketing ploy. Like, they actually don't want sick workers, and they recognize if they have a lot of sick workers that customers won't come to their restaurants. Right. So there are ways in which individuals at this point, individuals and groups, are incentivized to make choices that are in the interests both of the individual and actually of the common good. What we need to do is, one, at the authority level, we need to enable those choices. We need to help businesses reopen safely. We need to figure out ways to give businesses what they need in order to reopen safely, while also using a stick and telling them, in order to reopen, you have to have this, that, and another protocol. But I would also point out that I think that the patchwork approach that is currently seems to be happening will probably not serve us very well. Inevitably, there has to be a patchwork approach because New York City is not rural West Virginia. But for example, today, the governor of Maryland announced that there would be a movement to the next phase of reopening, but immediately the two collar counties of Washington, D.C. announced that they wouldn't move with the rest of the state. Are people going to be driving 50 miles to get a haircut? And doing various kinds of, in a sense, rational in one sense, irrational in another sense ways. So I do think some kind of coordinated opening with the appropriate safety protocols is the most equitable way to go, even if it is difficult and challenging.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a couple of other questions about some of the most vulnerable groups in society that I think are very profound. One about prisoners. This is, I mean, a prison must be one of the worst places one could be at the moment. There's not a lot of discussion, I would say, in the media about our obligations towards prisoners. And so one sees articles about white collar, the Paul Manaforts of the world, getting to go home while, presumably, many people are living in conditions where, the virus is everywhere in their world. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about prisoners and what we owe to that group of people.
Sure. Well, I agree. And in a sense, any group of people who are involuntarily maintained in a group facility might be, whether it's a nursing home or a prison, might be the most vulnerable population, in part because they often are prevented from taking individual measures to minimize their risk, if that makes sense. Like many of us can do that, but these populations can't, and so that imposes, I think, a special obligation to implement protocols that make it possible for safety. I think the big challenge in prisons is to try to figure out how to implement those while maintaining the security of the prison. No easy task. So I don't envy the people who have to make those choices. That is a challenge, and I don't know enough about prisons to go further. I just know that those are the choices that would have to go on. Obviously, if you have a prison protocol that somehow leads to conflicts or fighting between the prisoners, this could obviously lead to harms that are proportionate to the harms of the virus.
Right. Thank you. And so then we have a question about immigrants, and this is from Emily Francomano. So basically, the question is that, in some sense, the talk of reopening the economy is meaningless to people who have been working through this whole period. Maybe right. Exposing themselves, and who are working in a kind of gray economy where maybe some of the rules, don't apply at all. So I guess the question is, what would be the effect of reopening the economy for these folks? And again, maybe you could speak a little bit to what we owe this group of people in our society.
Well, so here there is also, I think, a deep need for a finer grained analysis. So many of the measures that we have taken to try to alleviate some of the pain of the economic shutdown, especially stimulus checks and expanded unemployment benefits, do not accrue to many immigrant workers, especially undocumented immigrants. And so there's a special vulnerability there. But I would add, I think that an additional challenge is that many immigrant workers are employed either in essential but hidden functions like farm work and meat packing, or they may be the hardest hit in the economy. So the hotels and restaurants are shut down in downtown DC. It is just striking, the ghost town effect you get going through downtown DC. And we all recognize that immigrants perform absolutely essential jobs to that economy, but that economy is wiped out. And so those folks are exposed in a special way and need special attention.
Yeah, thank you. So we have just a few minutes left, and unfortunately there's a lot of, as you can imagine, there's a lot of questions that we won't get to, but I thought maybe we could end by sort of moving from our current situation and kind of thinking about the future in two different ways. I guess the first is we have a number of questions about, you wrote a book called The Vice of Luxury about how we consume. Are we learning things now about how we consume that we could change our behavior in the future in beneficial ways? And then I guess the second is connected with your work on the environment. So are there lessons from this crisis that could be applied to thinking about the environment going forward?
So let me start with the luxury question. The most important principle about the economy in Catholic social teaching is called the universal destination of goods. The idea that private property has a social mortgage and contains social obligations to use especially one's excess property for the common good. What this crisis does in a bunch of ways is show that we have not been doing that in radical ways. We have not, for example, been paying what we need to pay for groceries and these kinds of things, and we have shorted workers. We have not been saving the way that we should save. The lack of saving in the United States has been documented for decades. And this is exactly the kind of crisis where if there is saving, it can be valued. Of course, many workers cannot save because they are forced to scrape by because people will not pay enough for their goods. So in all of these ways, I think there's an invitation for us to think about the ways in which we redirect our excess income to private consumption, enjoyment things. We don't pay enough for those things. And then we cheap out on groceries or we cheap out on meat in order to pay for the luxury consumption. That is contrary to the universal destination of goods. And I hope coming out of the crisis, we can rethink that. In terms of the environment, this could be a whole another discussion. The shutdown is particularly good for the environment. Obviously, but it's also not sustainable. And so the question about whether we can shift our consumption over the long run, I think, is a crucial one.
Yeah, thank you. I guess just to end on the environment, I mean, are there lessons? And I think one of the things that's coming through for me from a lot of this discussion is that we went into this crisis a much less resilient society than we could have been for all sorts of reasons. Yes. Right. And so as we approach, environmental challenges, are there lessons of resilience that could be learned from this and applied?
That is an incredibly insightful point, Al, and I don't know that I can elaborate it any better than you can. The other thing that we did not direct our excess income to is pandemic preparedness. I mean, pandemics, they're not a new thing in the world, and we easily could have been better prepared at the beginning of this crisis to deal with the crisis. And so I think that should teach us lessons about the fact that the environmental crisis is also a kind of long-term crisis that we ought to be thinking about preparations for, because many of the preparations that go into addressing the environmental crisis are long-term issues, like how do we build our housing and our transportation systems in resilient ways. And resilient doesn't just mean they can manage hotter climate. Resilient means how can they use less energy? Yeah. And those are long-term strategies, just like investing in pandemic preparedness is a long-term strategy. So hopefully that kind of long-term thinking will get a boost out of this crisis.
Thank you. And thank you, David. I think we're going to have to end it here, although there are lots of questions. I think we'll have to have you back to continue this discussion as things unfold. So thank you again for your time today.
That would be great. Thank you, Al. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again. And so I just wanted to say that next week, we're actually going to be taking a historical perspective. We're going to be talking to Grant Quartermus, who's the curator at Tudor Place in Georgetown. And he's going to be talking about epidemics and pandemics throughout history of Georgetown and Washington, D.C. So thank you again, David, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. And hopefully we'll see you next Thursday. Take care.
The Zoom wave.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.